She was just walking home. Pearl Davis, 65, wasn't looking for trouble. She wore a soft navy church dress, held a worn leather Bible in one hand, and a bouquet of fresh lilies in the other. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in Hollow Creek, South Carolina, a peaceful neighborhood known more for barbecue cookouts and high school football games than breaking news headlines. The sun hung low, casting golden beams between the magnolias, and the air smelled faintly of honeysuckle and coming summer. But by the time she reached the corner of Hollow Creek Road and Juniper Avenue, the world had already shifted. A police cruiser idled across the street, not moving, just watching. And within minutes, a retired librarian would be pinned against a rusted iron fence by a man sworn to protect her. His forearm pressed to her throat, her lilies crushed under his boot. What Officer Blake Turner didn't know, what changed everything, was who Pearl Davis really was. Not just a gentle old woman with gray hair tucked in a bun. She was the wife of Marcus Davis, former chief clerk of court, a man who spent his entire life making sure justice didn't skip the quiet streets. And Marcus, on that very same Sunday, was pulling into town after attending a rededication ceremony for the very courthouse he once helped manage. 10 minutes. That's all it took. 10 minutes from peaceful hymnals to the high whine of sirens. 10 minutes from suspicion to escalation. From a question to a chokehold. From a woman walking home to a moment that would be streamed, shared, and seared into the memory of a town forever changed. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a story that cut through race, power, silence, and the very idea of belonging. It was the kind of moment that cracks open a system and demands everyone to look inside. In a nation still wrestling with justice, Pearl's story became a mirror. And in that reflection, we all had to ask, who do we protect, who do we punish, and what does it take to finally be seen? What happened on Hollow Creek Road wasn't just an incident. It was a reckoning. And now, the silence that once blanketed that town is gone. Because Pearl didn't just survive, she stood. And the world stood up with her. Pearl Davis lived a quiet, intentional life. Every step, every breath, every pause was deliberate, not out of age or frailty, but out of deep-rooted grace. At 65, Pearl wasn't slowing down. If anything, she had mastered the art of moving with purpose. In a world obsessed with speed and noise, she was a hymn played in stillness. People in Hollow Creek didn't just know her, they respected her. For decades, she was Ms. Pearl, the community librarian who could find you the right book faster than any search engine. She taught reading not just with phonics and flashcards, but with love. When Pearl retired, the library board threw her a potluck party. Kids she taught to read came back as college graduates, some even with children of their own. But retirement didn't mean retreat for her. She became even more visible, mentoring young girls at the community center, organizing voter registration drives, baking for every church fundraiser. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed when your porch light stayed off too long or when your kid had a cast on his arm. Sunday mornings were sacred. They always had been. Pearl attended St. Luke's Baptist Church not just for the sermon, but for the stillness it brought to her spirit. That particular Sunday marked the 42nd wedding anniversary she shared with her husband, Marcus. Though he was away that weekend at a courthouse rededication ceremony, she followed their tradition anyway. Walk home from church alone, cook his favorite dinner, and place lilies, his favorite flower, on the table with 2 candles, even if one remained unlit until he returned. As she stepped down from the church steps, dressed in her favorite dark blue crepe dress, she felt the breeze gently lift her hem. The Bible in her left hand was the same one Marcus gave her on their 10th anniversary. Its pages were wrinkled, underlined, loved. Her right hand clutched the bouquet of lilies wrapped in craft paper and tied with a faded blue ribbon. Her low-heeled shoes clicked softly on the pavement as she passed familiar homes, giving warm nods to neighbors out trimming their hedges or walking their dogs. She noticed the light playing through the dogwood trees, how it danced on the sidewalks like confetti. The smell of fresh-cut grass mingled with barbecue smoke from 2 doors down. The Matthews boys were playing basketball in their driveway, their laughter rising into the sky like little rockets of joy. She smiled, remembering how she used to read them bedtime stories at the library every Thursday. Pearl didn't carry a phone. Not today. This walk wasn't for texts, for social media, for distraction. It was for memory. It was for Marcus. It was for God. As she crossed Juniper Avenue, she glanced up at her own home, The little white cottage with a porch swing Marcus had hung himself. The wind chimes jingled in greeting. She could already picture the cornbread cooling on the stove, the roast in the oven, the table set with linen napkins and love. Every part of her walk home was a meditation, a moving prayer of gratitude. For breath, for strength, for decades of faith that had outlasted many storms. But life has a way of shifting when we least expect it, and in the few steps that followed, steps taken not in haste, but in peace, Pearl unknowingly walked into a moment that would shake her town, test her dignity, and call forth the fire she'd always carried quietly inside. Pearl was just 5 houses away from home when she noticed the cruiser. It wasn't unusual to see patrol cars in Hollow Creek. The town was small, the kind where deputies waved at passers-by and knew which kid belonged to which porch. But something about this one felt still. Not parked, not patrolling, just still. Like a hawk perched on a branch, waiting, watching. It sat angled across the street, wheels turned slightly as if it had slid into that position with quiet purpose. The windows were down just enough to catch the breeze, and in the driver's seat, a man leaned against the window frame. White, mid to late 30s, buzzed hair, no sunglasses, no phone in his hand, just eyes, locked on her. Pearl didn't startle. She didn't even flinch. She had learned, over years and decades, how to recognize scrutiny without acknowledging it. She walked on, head high, stride even, her Bible close to her chest, lilies bouncing gently with each step. But inside, a switch flipped. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. A knowing. She had felt this before. In grocery store parking lots. At rest stops off the highway. In voting lines. That moment when presence becomes suspicion. When brown skin alone demands explanation. The cruiser door creaked open with the sound of a heavy assumption. Footsteps followed. Measured, confident, not quite fast but certainly purposeful. Pearl stopped walking. She turned slowly, pivoting with practiced grace, the kind that comes from decades of not being allowed to look startled. "Ma'am," the voice called. Southern. Firm. Flat. She met his gaze directly. "Yes, officer?" He stopped 6 feet away, his right hand resting casually on his belt. Not on the gun, not yet, but close enough to send a message. His eyes dropped to the Bible, the lilies, then to the dove-shaped brooch pinned to her chest. "You live around here?" he asked. Pearl's reply was gentle, but steady. "I do. Just there." She nodded toward her cottage. "Coming from church?" he continued. "I am." He nodded, then paused. The kind of pause that tries to create suspicion where none exists. "You got ID on you?" She raised an eyebrow slightly. "May I ask why?" "We had a call," he said. "Someone matching your description. Possibly Casing Holmes." Pearl didn't laugh. Didn't scoff. She simply tilted her head. "I've walked this block for over 30 years, officer. I'm not casing anything. I'm going home." His tone sharpened. "I need to see your ID." Pearl stayed calm. Her voice didn't rise. "Have I committed a crime?" His jaw clicked. "Ma'am, I'm asking nicely. And I'm answering honestly," she replied. "If you don't have probable cause, I'm not required to produce identification under South Carolina law." The space between them tightened, though neither moved. The quiet on the block suddenly felt heavier, like the air was holding its breath. Pearl didn't step forward. She didn't back away. She stood. The officer's name tag read Turner. Officer Blake Turner. His shoulders squared. "You refusing to comply?" "I'm refusing to be harassed," Pearl replied. Turner took 1 step forward. Now, Pearl could smell the aftershave, see the little sunburn at the edge of his scalp, notice the way his thumb flexed near his flashlight. The kind of detail you only observe when you've lived through moments that ask, "How fast can this get worse?" "I won't ask again," Turner said. "Show me ID or you'll be detained." Pearl tightened her grip on the lilies. "Then do what you think you need to do. But I suggest you think carefully." And for just a second, it looked like he might. Like maybe the stillness between them would win. But Turner shifted his weight forward. And in that instant, the moment changed. Because power doesn't ask for permission. It assumes. And Pearl Pearl didn't move. She had faced bigger men, darker moments, and deeper injustices. But still she stood, on her own block, under a sun that should have felt like safety, now watching it all flicker behind a badge that saw her not as a person, but as a profile. The moment Officer Turner stepped forward and grabbed Pearl's arm, it wasn't just contact, it was a collision of two realities. His grip was tight, firm, unmistakably aggressive. It wasn't about procedure. It wasn't about protection. It was about power. Pearl didn't scream. She didn't cry out. But her breath caught, sharp and shallow, not out of fear but out of memory. Memory of every time a boundary had been crossed, every time she had been told to sit down, be quiet, stay small. But she wasn't small. Not now. Not ever. Turner yanked her backward. The bouquet of lilies flew from her hand and scattered across the sidewalk like spilled truth. Some petals were torn, others crushed beneath his boot as he spun her, pressing her body hard against the black iron fence. Her Bible, the one she had carried for decades, fell to the pavement with a thud, pages fluttering open to Psalms. His forearm came across her chest, high and heavy, just below her throat. It wasn't a full chokehold, but it was enough to silence her voice, enough to trap her breath. "You're resisting," Turner hissed. Pearl met his gaze. Her voice, though strained, was steady. "I'm standing." He didn't like that answer. Men like Turner didn't expect defiance to come so calmly. He applied more pressure, leaning in, his mouth close enough for her to smell the bitterness in his breath, the tension in his jaw. His other hand hovered near his utility belt, ready for escalation. Across the street, the scene had begun to gather weight. A teenage girl holding a mocha latte stopped in her tracks, eyes wide, phone already rising to record. An elderly couple walking their dog paused, mouths agape, unsure whether to step in or stay safe. A FedEx driver, halfway through scanning a delivery, leaned out of his truck window with a furrowed brow. A boy on a skateboard dropped his board and ran to the nearest porch. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" a man shouted from his stoop. "She didn't do anything." Turner didn't budge. "Back off," he barked. "This doesn't concern you." "Oh, it does now," another voice rang out. "You've got 20 phones on you, man. You really want this going viral." Turner's hands didn't move, but his eyes did, scanning, calculating. He saw the crowd. He saw the phones. He saw the judgment forming in real time. But something in him, the pride, the authority, the certainty, kept him locked in place. Pearl's chest rose against the weight of his arm. She wasn't gasping, but she was winded. Still, she didn't break eye contact. "You don't get to do this," she whispered. "Not today." Another step closer, this time from a woman in scrubs, just off her nursing shift. "You're hurting her. Let go. She's not a threat." The moment cracked. Not with noise, but with the shift of power. Turner flinched. Just barely. Enough for Pearl to feel the pressure lighten on her chest. But still, he didn't release her. The Bible at her feet lay open to Psalm 37. "The wicked draw the sword, but their swords will pierce their own hearts." Her gaze flicked down, just for a second. Then she looked back at Turner. "You don't know who I am," she said. And he didn't. He saw an old black woman walking alone with flowers and a Bible. He didn't see a community pillar, a wife, a mentor, a quiet storm. But the people watching, they did. "Get your hands off her," a teenager yelled. "We're streaming this to Facebook." "You better let her go now," came another voice. Turner's resolve began to shake. He stepped back, not fully, just enough to stop contact. Pearl stood upright, pressing a palm to her collarbone, catching her breath. She didn't stagger. She didn't collapse. The crowd surged slightly closer. "You okay, ma'am?" someone asked. Pearl nodded once, eyes still on Turner. "He assaulted me," she said clearly. "In front of all of you. And they believed her. Because they saw it. Because they filmed it. Because no badge, no uniform, no excuse could erase what had just happened." Across the street, sirens blipped. Not loud, not full blast. Just enough to signal. Backup was coming. From where? No one knew yet. But Turner heard it too. He stepped back again. Pearl picked up her Bible, bent down slowly, with grace, and lifted the crushed lilies. Her voice was low but firm. "This won't disappear," she said. "Not this time." And behind her, the crowd murmured in agreement. "Not this time." The low hum of a vehicle turning onto Hollow Creek Road cut through the rising tension like a razor. A black SUV moved in fast, but not reckless, controlled, precise. The crowd, already gathered with phones raised and voices trembling between concern and outrage, instinctively parted as the vehicle rolled to a stop at the curb. Out stepped Marcus Davis. He didn't slam the door. He didn't sprint. He didn't need to. He walked with that slow, deliberate stride of a man who knew the weight of every eye in the room. Except now, the room was the street, and the courtroom was made of concrete and judgment. Marcus stood tall, 6'3", shoulders broad, suit tailored, tie loosened slightly from a long morning of speeches and ceremonies. But even without a robe or gavel, he carried authority. It was in his posture, in his silence, in the way the air seemed to bend around him as if even the wind paused to listen. He saw her immediately, Pearl, standing firm but breathless, a bouquet of bruised lilies in one hand, her Bible clutched in the other. Her posture wasn't weak, but it wasn't whole either. And then he saw him, Officer Turner, still puffed up, still scanning the crowd like he could regain control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. Marcus didn't raise his voice. "Step away from my wife," he said, voice like stone across glass. Turner blinked. The crowd went quiet. "I said," Marcus repeated, now just 2 steps closer, "step away." Turner's hands, moments ago a threat, now hovered in the air awkwardly, uncertain, unprepared. He took a half-step back, confusion battling pride behind his eyes. Pearl didn't speak. She didn't need to. Marcus was here now, and with him came the weight of every courtroom he had ever stood in, every injustice he had ever stared down without blinking. "I need your badge number," Marcus said calmly. "And I need it now." Turner hesitated, then stammered. "Sir, this is a misunderstanding." "No," Marcus interrupted, his tone cutting. "What happened here wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. One you made." The crowd murmured in agreement, their confidence growing in the presence of someone who clearly wasn't just any man off the street. "You assaulted a woman," Marcus continued. "Not just any woman. You assaulted a cornerstone of this community. And you did it in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, with no cause. That makes it criminal." Turner opened his mouth again, maybe to justify, maybe to apologize, but Marcus lifted a hand, not to threaten, but to silence. "Don't," he said. "You've done more than enough." Behind them, another set of sirens echoed, real this time. Backup. Possibly internal affairs. Maybe a superior. It didn't matter. What mattered was the shift. Turner wasn't the center of control anymore. Pearl took a slow breath, straightening beside her husband. Their hands brushed, just slightly. Not for reassurance. For grounding. "I got here as fast as I could," Marcus said softly to her. "I know," she replied. "But he already showed who he was." Marcus nodded. "And now it's our turn to show them who we are." Phones kept recording. Neighbors kept watching. But the story had already changed. The moment Turner laid hands on Pearl, he didn't just commit an act of force. He sparked a reckoning. And the man who now stood before him wasn't here for vengeance. He was here for justice. And justice remembers. By the time the second patrol car arrived, half the block was holding its breath. No one had moved, but everyone had changed. Phones were still pointed. Voices, once whispers, had grown bolder. The silence that used to surround these streets like a soft blanket had burned away, replaced by the hum of a reckoning. The first video hit Twitter 20 minutes later. 30 seconds long. Tight frame. Clear audio. An elderly black woman, unarmed and unthreatening, was shoved against a fence. A white police officer's forearm pressed against her collarbone. She held nothing but flowers and a Bible. Within an hour, the clip had been retweeted over 40,000 times. Hashtag Justice for Pearl was born. People didn't just share the video, they shared context. Locals added backstory. Former students talked about Ms. Pearl teaching them how to read. A retired firefighter posted, "That woman ran our book drive for 15 years. She's not a criminal. She's a saint." A pastor chimed in, "If Pearl Davis isn't safe in Hollow Creek, who is?" By nightfall, regional news vans had parked near the church. Bright lights and long cables stretched across lawns usually reserved for lemonade stands and lawn chairs. Pearl hadn't said much since returning home. She sat quietly on the porch, a glass of sweet tea on the table beside her, untouched. Marcus stood nearby, phone in one hand, jaw clenched tight. He'd spoken with lawyers, council members, even a local journalist he'd once mentored back in law school. But when the doorbell rang just after 8 p.m., it wasn't a reporter. It was 6 women, all in their 60s or older, all holding hand-painted signs. They didn't knock. They didn't chant. They simply stood on the sidewalk, holding signs that read, "I am Pearl, don't touch our mothers, protect our elders, and we see you." Pearl rose slowly. No words, just a nod. And one by one, more people joined them. Teachers, postal workers, teenagers with skateboards, young parents pushing strollers. They didn't come to shout. They came to stand. The following morning, a peaceful protest circled Hollow Creek's police precinct. It was quiet, powerful, purposeful. Hundreds walked with candles in hand. Some wore ribbons tied around their arms. Others wore church hats in Pearl's honor. Marcus held a press conference at noon. Pearl stood beside him, not as a victim, but as a pillar. "This isn't about one woman," Marcus said into the microphones. "It's about how easily someone wearing a badge can confuse dignity with defiance. It's about how quickly respect can be mistaken for resistance." Pearl stepped forward then. The air stilled. "My name is Pearl Davis," she said, "and I will not be erased." Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned in. "I've lived in this town longer than that officer's been alive. I've served this community, raised children, buried friends, taught people to read, to believe in themselves, to build something better. And still, I was seen as a threat, because I didn't bow my head fast enough." She took a breath. Her voice didn't shake. "We are not threats. We are history. We are strength. And we will not shrink to make others comfortable." The crowd behind her erupted in applause. Not explosive, but emotional. Deep. Resonant. The clip of her speech was posted that evening. By dawn, it had reached national outlets. Pearl Davis, retired librarian, had become a symbol, not of protest, but of presence. Not of rage, but of resilience. And the whole country was starting to listen. The courtroom was packed, not with lawyers or media elites, but with the people who knew Pearl Davis. People who had shared pews with her at St. Luke's, who remembered when she organized the town's first community book fair, who still had one of her peach cobblers wrapped in foil in their freezer. They came not for spectacle, but for truth. The room buzzed with low murmurs as the judge entered, an older black woman whose eyes flicked briefly toward Pearl before calling the court to order. There was no need to remind anyone to remain silent. Respect hung thick in the air. Pearl sat with her back straight, hands folded, wearing a soft charcoal suit and the same dove-shaped brooch she wore the day of the incident. Marcus sat beside her, jaw locked but calm. His left hand rested lightly over hers, a gesture of grounding more than protection. On the other side, Officer Blake Turner sat behind his attorney, noticeably smaller than the man who had shoved Pearl against a fence. The badge was gone, the gun holster replaced by an ill-fitting suit. His gaze stayed mostly on the desk in front of him, flinching only when video clips played. And play they did. Multiple angles. From phone cameras, security footage, dash cams. There was no room for misinterpretation. Pearl wasn't a blur in the background. She was the story. Her voice was clear. "I'm standing," she said on the recording, and the courtroom held its breath. One juror visibly swallowed hard. The prosecution called up witnesses. The first was a local nurse, still in scrubs, who had been walking home that day. She described Pearl's posture, her lack of aggression, the dangerous amount of pressure Turner used. "Her airway was restricted," she said plainly. That could have ended very differently. A young teenager who had live-streamed the incident to TikTok took the stand next. "I've known Ms. Pearl since I was little. She helped me get my first library card. She never even raised her voice at us kids." His voice cracked near the end. "She wasn't dangerous. She was just existing." A former police trainer followed. He had taught use of force protocols to half the state's departments. "What I saw," he said while pausing the footage, "was a clear violation of departmental policy. No verbal threat. No physical resistance. And yet, he escalated to physical force." Turner's lawyer tried to argue stress, community tension, and a misunderstood intent to detain. But no one in the room seemed to buy it, especially not the jury. Then Pearl was called. She walked slowly to the stand, not because she was frail, but because she understood the weight of what she carried. Every eye turned toward her. Every camera angle was locked. Every microphone tuned in. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "My name is Pearl Davis. I am 65 years old. I've lived in Hollow Creek for over 4 decades. I've been a teacher, a librarian, a neighbor, a mentor. And that day, I was none of those things to that man. To him, I was a problem to control, not a woman to respect." She paused, scanning the jury with soft but unshaken eyes. "I wasn't loud. I wasn't armed. I wasn't breaking any law. I was just walking home. And that's what made me dangerous in his eyes. That I dared to walk with confidence, that I didn't shrink, that I didn't comply out of fear." Silence settled over the courtroom like fog. "I didn't come here to ruin a man's life," she continued. "But I won't protect a system that lets him ruin someone else's." By the time she stepped down, even the stenographer's eyes were wet. Deliberation took less than a day. The verdict: guilty on all counts: assault, use of excessive force, and civil rights violations. Pearl didn't smile when the judge read the decision. She just let out a long, steady breath. The kind that comes after holding your dignity so tightly for so long, you forget what it feels like to exhale. Outside, a quiet crowd had gathered. Pearl didn't give a speech. She simply looked up at the sea of faces and said, "Thank you, not just for standing with me, but for staying with me." And they did. Change didn't come overnight, but it came. In the days following the verdict, Hollow Creek found itself at the center of national headlines. "Elderly librarian wins civil rights case," read one. Another, "Pearl Davis shows small towns how big justice can be." But to those who lived in Hollow Creek, this wasn't just news, it was an opportunity. A moment to reckon with what they had ignored, excused, or simply never had to confront. The first visible change came from the police department. Officer Turner's badge and certification were permanently revoked. His personnel file, previously sealed, was made public under a new transparency policy enacted by the city council. But Pearl had said it best during the post-trial press conference. One man did this, but one man didn't create this. So, the city acted. The mayor, a moderate centrist up for re-election, surprised many by announcing a task force to review the entire structure of community policing in Hollow Creek. Pearl was named an honorary advisor, though she insisted on no title. "If I'm going to sit in that room, I'm going to speak from the pews, not the podium," she told them. The city approved 5 key reforms within the first month. 1. Mandatory body camera usage, with quarterly audits by a third party. 2. An anonymous internal misconduct reporting system, open to both officers and citizens. 3. Bias and de-escalation training, not as a box-checking exercise but as a continuous curriculum. 4. Community walk-alongs, where officers shadow residents for a day in their lives. Shopping, working, attending school functions. 5. The creation of a civilian oversight committee with full access to records, the power to recommend discipline, and at least one seat reserved for a senior citizen. Pearl accepted that seat, but only after asking the committee to meet in the public library once a month. "Let accountability happen where learning happens," she said, and they agreed. Marcus, meanwhile, returned to advocacy, joining forces with 2 other retired judges to write a policy brief that was circulated across the state. They proposed a standardized misconduct response template for all municipalities, something no South Carolina town had adopted before. By year's end, 3 other cities had implemented it. The Davis home became something of a landmark. People left lilies on the front gate. Children colored cards that read, "Thank you, Ms. Pearl." One even drew her with a cape. She laughed when she saw it. "They think I'm a superhero," she told Marcus. But I just stood still. News anchors called her a civil rights icon. She rejected the term. "I'm not Rosa Parks," she said. "I'm someone who remembered her dignity and refused to drop it, no matter who tried to take it." Churches held forums. Schools updated their civics curriculum to include case studies in local justice. One teacher invited Pearl to speak via Zoom. "The kids were more interested in her than any historical figure we've ever studied," the teacher later wrote. And the Hollow Creek Police Department? It changed. Slowly, but meaningfully. A new police chief was appointed, an Afro-Latina woman with roots in restorative justice. She reached out to Pearl her first week. They had tea on the porch. No press. No quotes. Just two women trying to understand what safety really meant. By the first anniversary of the incident, Pearl returned to the same spot where it all began. She stood there for a moment, flowers in hand. The fence had been repainted. A plaque had been installed nearby with the inscription, "Let this ground remember her name." And it did. Long after the cameras left and headlines faded, Pearl Davis's life didn't return to normal. It evolved into something deeper. She still lived in the same white cottage on Juniper Avenue, still watered her rose bushes in the early mornings, still walked to the church on Sundays. But everything felt slightly shifted. Not heavier, not lighter, just different. As if the air itself knew what she'd been through, and chose to hold space for her now. People still stopped her in the grocery store, sometimes just to say thank you. Others, especially older black women, would simply squeeze her hand and offer no words, just presence. That silent knowing. One afternoon, while sitting on her porch, Pearl received a letter postmarked from Minneapolis. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman named Clarice who wrote, "When I saw what you endured and how you stood, I saw my grandmother. I saw myself. Thank you for not letting them take your breath, so we could catch ours." Pearl read it twice. Then she folded it neatly and placed it in a box she kept in her hallway closet, labeled The Witnesses. It held dozens of letters like that now. Some came with poems, others with stories of their own, unfair traffic stops, workplace harassment, public shaming. It was, in many ways, a second library, except this time, the books were lives, and the stories were real. And not all stories were from strangers. Some came from people in town. One evening, after a town hall meeting, a white man in his late 40s approached her. He wore a Hollow Creek Little League cap and carried himself like someone who hadn't always been on her side. "I used to think folks like me had nothing to do with how folks like you were treated," he admitted, eyes down. "But after watching that video, after seeing how calm you were, how wrong it was, I realized I was just pretending not to see. I'm sorry." Pearl didn't offer forgiveness quickly, but she offered him something else, a seat beside her on the community garden board. And he showed up, every week. Her story also sparked deeper conversations within her own family. Her nieces began organizing local youth groups. Her younger cousin, once skeptical of activism, started studying social work. "You turned surviving into something sacred," he told her one night over dinner. But perhaps the most unexpected shift came from within Pearl herself. She began journaling again. Every night. Not about the case. Not about the officer. But about how she felt, truly felt, walking through a world that had tried to shrink her. One entry read, "It's strange. I've always believed in the Lord, always believed in justice. But now I also believe in the power of simply being seen. Really seen. Not as a file or a body or a headline, but as a full person. No explanation needed. That was the heart of it. She had been seen. And that changed everything. There's a moment, somewhere between the headlines and the healing, when a story becomes something more. It becomes a mirror. Pearl Davis didn't set out to make history. She didn't lead marches or write policy papers. She didn't shout into megaphones or hold press conferences. She simply walked home. With her Bible. With her flowers. With her dignity. And that, quiet as it may seem, was an act of resistance. Because the world has long expected women like Pearl to shrink. To defer. To say, "Yes, sir," even when their rights are being trampled. But Pearl did something revolutionary in its simplicity. She stood. And in doing so, she reminded us of a few truths we often forget. First, silence is not always peace. Pearl's calm wasn't submission, it was clarity. The strength to say, "I know who I am," without needing to raise her voice. That kind of calm rattles systems built on fear. Second, accountability doesn't start in the courtroom. It starts at the crosswalk. It starts when you choose not to look away. When you speak up, not just for yourself, but for the person across the street who may not have the strength or safety to do so. Third, real change isn't viral. It's local. It's neighbors sitting on porches together. It's difficult conversations held in church basements. It's small policies rewritten by people who've finally chosen to listen. And finally, perhaps most importantly, dignity is not a privilege. It is a right. Not something earned by age, title, or performance, but something inherent to every person. Pearl didn't demand to be respected because she was a librarian or a judge's wife. She expected it because she existed. So, what now? What do we do with a story like Pearl's? We carry it. We teach it. We protect the next Pearl before she ever has to say, "I'm standing." We challenge the moments when power oversteps, even when they seem small. Especially then. And we remember that sometimes, the most powerful act isn't a protest sign or a courtroom victory. Sometimes, it's a woman holding lilies, refusing to bow. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Teach it to your children. Let it live, not as a headline, but as a habit. And the next time you see someone simply standing, see them. Really see them.